Good afternoon, and welcome to the penultimate webinar in the Center for Environmental Policy of the School of Public Affairs series on ideas, interests, institutions, and nation-state climate politics. Today, we are very fortunate to have speakers from spanning the world, straddling hemispheres. Well, no, not, yes, East and West, I guess. No, actually not. Straddling continents. Anyway, today the topic is who pays for this? Can carbon pricing and Green New Deals be equitable solutions? And we are very fortunate to have as our first speaker, Katja Biedenkopf, who is Associate Professor of Sustainability Politics at Leuven International and European Studies, which is LNES at KU Leuven. After that, she will be followed by Daniela Stevens, Professor of Political Science at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics, CIDE, in Mexico City. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the second to the last in our series. The last of these webinars will be next Tuesday afternoon, a bit later than this time, from 3:30 to 5 p.m., and we will discuss hard cases for climate policy, Australia and Brazil. So that, again, will be, that will be May 16th, which I believe is Monday. That will be Monday, May 16th. So we're changing the order a little bit of when these are offered. The last one will be Monday, and it will be 3:30 to 5 p.m., given that, indeed, we'll have speakers from around the world also and need to accommodate their time. So today we want to thank, first of all, Dr. Biedenkopf for joining us late in the day where she is in Europe, and we welcome all of you and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you very much for, my apologies. Thank you very much for inviting me to give a little presentation on carbon pricing policies and also the Green Deal or the European Green Deal. But I would like to leave the Green Deal for the discussion and maybe rather focus on carbon pricing in the presentation. And I'm just in the process of sharing my screen, which now should be up. Okay, so, well, yes, here it is. Okay, great. So what I'd like to do in the next, well, let's say 20 minutes is trying to look at carbon pricing and focusing on the question of whether that actually can be an equitable solution and what that would mean. How can a carbon pricing policy be just? And is there actually an answer or one answer to this question of whether and how carbon pricing can be just? Just a little reminder of those of you who are not very familiar with carbon pricing policies, but also to just clarify what I would like to focus on, because carbon pricing policies actually is probably much broader than what I focus on. I'd like to focus on two things. One is carbon taxes, and that basically means that a government says that for certain products or other activities, per ton of carbon, the covered actors need to pay a certain amount of money. And then the idea is the more carbon intensive that, let's say, product is, the more expensive it gets compared to low carbon or zero carbon competing products. So through a pricing signal, a carbon tax tries to influence behavior, purchasing behavior or other behavior by consumers, but could also be other kinds of actors like companies. The other kind of carbon pricing policy that I also include in my short talk today is cap and trade or emissions trading systems. And the logic is similar in the sense that here as well, products or services that are high carbon, that emit many carbon emissions will become more expensive compared to the low carbon or zero carbon competing products or services. But the price is established in a different way. Here, the government would not say a ton of carbon costs that amount of money. Here, the government would say, we allow only a certain number of emissions within the jurisdiction and among the different entities that are covered. And each of those entities then at the end of mostly a year, so a certain reporting period, has to surrender to the government or the authorities an allowance for each of the tons of carbon that they emitted. And then through scarcity, so demand and supply of those allowances, which can never be more than the cap that the government set, the price will be influenced. So here the government actually knows very well how many emissions will come out of that policy. Well, if everyone complies with the policy, of course, but they don't know what the price is. While with a carbon tax, they know the price, what the price is, they know how much money they will get, well, depending on the emissions, of course, but they don't necessarily know what the carbon related outcome will be. But in general, the logic of trying to influence behavior through a price signal by making high carbon activities or products more expensive compared to low carbon is the same of those policies. And that's why I'd like to talk about both of them. I'll in the end talk a bit about the bigger picture of what other kinds of pricing policies there are as well at also different levels of governance. But if we stick to those two and we think about justice, fairness, then I don't know whether any one of you is following European news, but then often here in Europe, at least, this kind of picture would come to mind. This is just a photo taken, I think 2 years ago in France. And what happened there was that President Macron wanted to adopt a carbon tax. So basically make fuels more expensive in that case. And what that triggered was a movement that's by now called the Yellow Vest or Gilets Jaunes movement. So they all wore these yellow vests, went to the streets and really protested for a number of weeks and months. And in the end, the carbon tax was withdrawn. And of course, they didn't just do that because they like protesting. The argument was very much a justice argument. It was our cost of living is already high. We depend on cars and heating and other things related to fossil fuels. And this is a burden that we, the normal workers, the normal people, cannot afford. So this is really a very classic reaction of fear that governments also would have. So yeah, if you're rich and fuels become a bit more expensive, the impact on you is not very high. If you're poor and the prices for something essential like transportation or heating, if that increases, it's of course a very, or can be a very big problem. So there you have already the answer why justice is a very important aspect of carbon pricing. This was now an example of a carbon tax, but we also have examples of emissions trading and justice. And what I put here on this slide is a photo from California. And so what happened there was that the Californian government wanted to update its cap and trade system and prolong it for another decade. And there, the environmental justice movement, which, you know, intuitively you would maybe think, oh, they're for the environment, so they're for the climate policy. They were actually very skeptic. And the reason why they did not like that law was that the flexibility in a cap and trade system would allow, for example, a company to take very strategic decisions, to maybe say, okay, overall, it makes economic sense for me to have that many allowances. So I keep this one polluting factory open. I don't invest there, but I improve, I don't know, my other facilities in other parts of the country or of the state. So pollution is not necessarily equally reduced in the entire, well, in this case, state or country or other jurisdiction. And of course, classic environmental justice development is that the more polluting facilities are often there where low income and vulnerable parts of the population live. So there again, an injustice aspect that is the result from, in this case, not necessarily the price, but the flexibility of that policy. So two different justice angles, but in the end, very much linked to this overall policy tool or approach of carbon pricing. One answer that you could have, of course, is, okay, then let's not go for carbon pricing and adopt another, maybe more command and control policy. But that's actually not what we see. What we see in all over the world actually is that a number of jurisdictions, and as you can clearly see here, it's not necessarily countries. So often that's why I use the word jurisdiction, because I can't, for lack of a better word, in a way. You can see here it's cities, Tokyo, it's subnational entities like California, it's countries like Mexico, but it's also supranational entities like the European Union. And they're all over the globe. South Africa has a carbon tax, the European Union has an emissions trading system, and some individual European countries have a carbon tax in addition. And each of those policies looks a bit different. You don't need to look at the details of this map. I just think also thought with the nice colorful illustration, it just shows and highlights that it is really, a big puzzle of different pieces of laws and policies, and none of them is designed in exactly the same way as the other. So they all look a bit different. And all the countries or jurisdictions are a bit different as well. So this leads really to this patchwork of different carbon pricing policies, but also different climate justice or equity provisions in them. So yeah, these policies are spreading around the world. Jurisdictions seem to like them as part of their policy mix. But when would we now say something is just? When would a carbon pricing policy actually be a just carbon pricing policy? That's a quite challenging discussion. Also, you know, as you already saw from these first two photos that I used and the first two examples that I told you about, the justice concerns or the equity concerns are not necessarily always the same. They can differ depending on the type of policy, but also on the type of jurisdiction. So just very quickly going through how could we then design such a policy in a more just way? And one way what we could do if we were a government that had adopted or were to design a carbon pricing policy is we could, well, of course, we generate money with this policy, either through selling the allowances if we don't distribute them for free, or by collecting the tax. So what we could do, of course, is giving them money back. So we collect the money and say every citizen gets a certain amount of money back. That would, of course, alleviate the burden on citizens in my example now, but it would not necessarily address the injustice that I mentioned when I told you about France, where, you know, the rich ones probably are not very much bothered by the tax, while the poor ones really struggle. If all of them get the same amount of money, the distributional aspect would maybe not be addressed so much. And that's why targeted direct transfers would actually address that. So some groups, less well-off households, could get more money, and through these transfers, the policy could actually be made more just. And actually, I put some examples, and it's really just some illustrative examples in the last column, and actually have not found one where this is nicely illustrated, you know, really with the targeted transfers, but I'm still looking into that. Another way that actually is done in a number of policies is tax cuts. So not cuts in the carbon tax, but for example, in the income tax. Or in some other tax that would then reduce the burden on incomes, and could maybe be combined with a more targeted approach. Let's say if you cut income taxes in, you know, with some income groups in mind, and then the lower income groups would maybe get a bigger cut than the higher ones. But besides this returning money to citizens or other actors, what could also be considered just, and that would maybe respond more to the second example that I started off with, the California one, is green investment. So using the money that's collected and invested in renewable energy or in some other infrastructure that is actually supporting the transition to a low carbon economy. Or one other aspect that now is not necessarily linked to climate or environmental policy, but in general could also benefit the society, the population that is addressed or that lives under a certain carbon pricing policy, is public deficit reduction. So often countries or governments have debts, and the money could, of course, just flow into reducing the overall deficit of that particular country. Or what is also proposed by a number of people is pension funds. So sending that money that is collected to pension funds, and through this, basically, well, to some extent, you could argue it's maybe an intergenerational justice, is it? Well, maybe, but so basically benefiting society as a whole. So as you can see here already, just in theory, there are already quite different types of solutions of how we could design a carbon pricing policy to somehow address parts of the concerns that are raised earlier. But then there's a second aspect that I would like to raise in this regard. So, you know, you could, of course, say, yes, let's just look who's hit most by a carbon pricing policy, and let's relieve the burden on them most. The problem why we don't see that more often, or part of the problem why we don't see that more often, is that the most efficient or the most just design is not necessarily the one that most people of the population and most people of the electorate actually would accept or would prefer. So policymakers actually often seem to have to balance not just this concern of justice, but also, well, public acceptability. They want to be re-elected. They want to make policy that is accepted by a relatively large share of their population. So achieving maximum political support and maximum fairness are not necessarily the same, and that really complicates this whole story. And that leads then to the question, so how do policymakers do this now? How do they decide whether and what kind of climate justice provision they include in their policies, or what influences those decisions? And I think there's already a difference between carbon tax and emissions trading system. I already mentioned that earlier, that the logics and the justice implications are a bit different, so the design would look different as well. Of course, it depends very much on the scope, how many sectors, products, etc. are included, but also, and that very much links to the acceptability aspect as well, is visibility and salience. And there, actually, the carbon taxes often are more visible to the citizen, and then often also challenged more or struggle more with this public acceptability versus justice angle. But of course, it depends very much on the jurisdiction and the policy. But it also links to framing. Some carbon taxes are not even called carbon taxes for the reason that people often don't like paying taxes. And if something is called a levy or a fee or something else, then it actually is more acceptable. But also, of course, on how stringent it is, how high the price is, makes a difference. And the higher the carbon price, the bigger the impact and the more the need for addressing the justice angle. But what I mentioned earlier already, certainly for the carbon taxes, some countries actually have a high fuel price without a carbon tax. So they levy a tax, but it's not called a carbon tax. So there's also other aspects that increase the price or that explain a high price already before a carbon tax is introduced. And that can also explain some of the justice implications. How rich or poor a country is, of course, is a factor, but also the social inequality. So in equal societies, everyone more or less equally rich or equally poor, or are there large discrepancies that, of course, would then require or make justice provisions more relevant than in a relatively equal society. But politics really play a very big role as well. Certainly, what we sometimes see is with the systems, the first past the post systems, where politicians really are probably a bit more visible with their own program and really try to fight for every vote. Yeah, their justice often is used maybe a bit more in coalition governments. You would maybe have more one party that's emphasizing it, but another one not, and that in the end can, of course, have an impact on the policy design and the politics that follow. Interest groups, of course, play a big role as well, and different external events. I don't know, a drought, a flood, and those kinds of things can, of course, also exacerbate certain developments. So and of course there can be a mix of varying recycling. So this is really a list of very different kinds of factors that other people have found in studies and that are collected through a literature review. What I am currently doing is thinking about how that fits into a framework of ideas, interests, and institutions to structure it a bit more, because it really is quite a puzzle of different kinds of reasons. But I think it fits in the in this framework of ideas, interests, and institutions, in the sense that institutions, existing rules, decision-making structures, political systems, all those kinds of parameters explain maybe already a bit what why policymakers would take certain decisions, but also path dependencies and more structural factors that can explain, equality or inequality, history of an environmental justice movement, and those kinds of things. Can, of course, maybe also explain why in certain jurisdictions we see more of those discussions and then also provisions than in others. But of course, also interests in, I mentioned certain lobbying groups, etc. So depending on, divergence or convergence of interests, I think that can explain certain provisions. And ideas, yes, on my, the table that I showed you, that's basically ideas often developed by think tankers, academics, and then it, is also up to policy or idea entrepreneurs to bring those ideas into the different policy making processes. So I think in the end, that's, as I said, what I'm currently looking into. Those different factors could probably nicely fit into such a framework. One last aspect that I just wanted to mention, and I actually don't have the time, but not speaking for too long, is kind of circling back to this question, what is just, or what is justice? And here I just would like to remind us, and it's probably familiar to many of you, what often is differentiated in the climate justice literature. And that is, on the one hand, distribution. So the question of about how are costs and benefits allocated among actors. And if you think about these, the table and the things that I told you about, that's basically what these proposals are about. It's about how do we distribute the revenues from a carbon tax, etc. And how do we, through that, make it more fair. But when we look at the climate justice literature, there's more to it. There's also procedural justice and recognitional justice. And that is actually something which I have not really come across yet. The question of how are these decisions made? What are the procedures of designing carbon pricing policies? Are different communities, different actor groups involved in deciding on whether or not the proposed design would be just? And also the recognition of certain marginalized groups is something that is not necessarily a dominant discourse in the carbon pricing policy making realm, but I think it actually is very important if we think back to those cases that I told you about. And there's of course many more cases. And certainly in the California case, that seems to be a very important angle. Good. So this is, I guess a bit of a critique or an idea of how carbon pricing policy making should or could be made more just, to not only focus on the distributional aspects, but also think about procedures, think about recognition of certain groups. One very quick note, and this is my last slide, just to put this whole discussion in a bigger picture. I started off by saying I'm only focusing on carbon taxes and carbon trade systems. Carbon pricing actually is even broader. So there's a global carbon pricing, as I called it, so which basically under the Kyoto Protocol was what we call the clean development mechanism. So on a global scale, the idea that we could take money, invest it in a certain project in a developing country where emissions will be avoided or reduced. And then this would generate allowances that then other developed countries, actors in developed countries could buy, and their money actually would have been invested more efficiently because it's cheaper to reduce emissions in developing countries. So that's the basic idea of the CDM. But that also raises a number of climate justice issues, and certainly under the Paris Agreement, a number of those dynamics have changed. But yeah, it is a bit of a different debate, and that's why I have not focused on it here. But I wanted to mention that this is, of course, also a very important aspect on which some scholars work and which really deserves some attention. Then another point of, well, maybe criticism of my own presentation, in the sense that the overall webinar series is meant to focus on mitigation and adaptation. But if we look at the carbon pricing policies, certainly the ones that I talked to you about, but also in general, often it is it's very much mitigation and not so much adaptation. And then just one last point, which yeah, also falls into this broader group, is dynamics of payments for ecosystem services, RED+, so that there's actually a number of different kinds of global carbon pricing ideas. So basically the underlying idea being using payments for certain activities to make a certain behavior more attractive compared to another one. So payments for ecosystem services would be one of those cases where a payment for preserving I don't know, a certain ecosystem would prevent it from being deteriorated, because that otherwise would be an economic incentive. So very different dynamics, but the underlying motivation is very much the same, using a price signal to change behavior. And all of that, since it involves money, since it involves decisions of well, preserving, mitigating climate change, they often have quite some equity and justice implications. So that's just what I really wanted to highlight in the end. I did not want to claim that I'm exclusive, that I'm comprehensive in the kinds of carbon pricing policies that are addressed. And so I'd like to leave it here and give the floor to Daniela, or look forward to her comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katja. And we turn now to Professor Daniela Stevens of CIDE in Mexico City for her view. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd, very much for the invitation. Thank you, Katja. I appreciated listening to your presentation, and I understand that this is going to be a chapter, right?
Yes.
Very timely, very relevant for our times. It seems that every IPCC report is more dire and more catastrophic than the previous, so we need research like yours more than ever. I also enjoyed your presentation because it shifts our attention upstream to the supply side of policy analysis, so to speak. And also because it broadens our view to incorporate civil society, for example. And like you said, every specific design will have different sorts of implications. I cannot speak of Europe, for example. I can speak of the Americas. The question that you open with, what is a just carbon price? Again, it shifts our attention from the technical debates of efficiency that were key in the last decade to a social angle, and therefore a much contested and much politicized realm. So it's a very tall order that you have there to answer that question, and you certainly give us a variety of ways in which we can answer this and problematize this issue. Your title, who pays for this? It addresses an important component, who pays for a carbon price. I understand that, I mean, it's a catchy title, one needs a punchy title. I'm terrible myself at that, but your content goes way beyond that to consider mostly who gets the revenue, which is a different dimension altogether than who pays for the price. Who gets the revenue may or may have not paid for the price. So a somewhat superficial comment is that the title doesn't fully reflect the richness of what you share with us in the text or in the presentation. I have a very general question, and I suppose that the rest of my questions may span from this. And my question is, what is the purpose of this particular text? Because when you answer that, then you have a different direction if it's going to be literature review? Is it to introduce the reader to the topic? Will you be testing a hypothesis later on? And then from that clarification, I would ask other similar questions, like, will you have an empirical component? Will you illustrate with a case? You discussed different aspects. The first, and I think that the one that took most of the attention in your chapter, is revenue. The second was, who decides what fair is? Is it the public? Does fair overlap with efficient? And third, what influences the provision? So you covered a lot of topics. Like I said, most of the first part of the presentation revolved around this third aspect, in revenue. And let me go back to the first question that you posed. What is a just carbon pricing policy? I wonder, Katia, if it would be within the scope of this chapter to include answers that do not have to do with revenue. Revenue is key, of course, and some recent carbon pricing policies in North America, its adoption has revolved around what to do with the revenue. And I especially later appreciated the triangle of climate justice, because I was going to comment that there are different dimensions of justice. You have the economic, which is perhaps the most obvious, but you also have the ecological side of the spectrum. And on the other hand, you have the ethical implications that would include issues such as intergenerational justice, maybe race, or even democratizing the policy-making process. And I have a bunch of questions that you can choose to answer or not, whether they're germane to the work that to the direction that you want to take this work into. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking, well, you're of course the specialist in climate justice. I'm not very familiar with this specific literature, but I was wondering, how does one factor in the injustice of not having a carbon price? You know, I'm a carbon price advocate, so of course I'm going to ask that question. And it's especially difficult to answer because the effects of climate change usually do not occur or do not impact the most where the price is being imposed, right? That is yet another dimension of justice, that the developed world versus the vulnerable developing world. And I know Professor Eisenstadt here has written extensively about this. So what do you think about that? I'm very curious, and I want to hear your thoughts. Regarding policy complementarity, how to reconcile, for example, climate justice and energy justice? How to evaluate a carbon price with a life cycle perspective and its interactions and its overlaps with other policies? If I'm not mistaken, climate justice literature, as you pointed out in your lit review, is mostly, please correct me if I'm wrong, is mostly about how to avoid negative costs, how to distribute costs and benefits like revenue, in this case of carbon price. And I have noticed that the energy transition and energy justice literature has more broadly tackled these two aspects of your triangle that you mentioned in the end, the procedural, the recognition side. So maybe it would be a good literature to complement what you're already doing. To also go beyond benefits such as revenue or beyond this kind of costs. And I can, like I said, I can relate this to policy complementarity because speaking for Latin America, again, I don't know a lot about Europe, but the Latin American carbon prices are so low and they are not the most important piece of the puzzle. The most important is energy, I think. You mentioned the example of Macron and the yellow vests. We also have in Latin America the example of Lenin Moreno, the former president of Ecuador. In 2019, he tried to eliminate the subsidy on energy, and the country went, there were violent demonstrations. So I'm sure the country would have been upset about a carbon price, but this really took upset to a whole different level. The president had to repeal the policy. So how are you considering these complementarity issues with other policies that are not carbon pricing, but that may affect justice in a much deeper way, especially when carbon prices in some places of the world are very much symbolic? Let me see. And finally, you did mention interest groups, for example, but climate justice is highly politicized. How do we govern those costs? How do we do it? You mentioned public acceptability as an important component, yes, but how about this politicization of climate policy, and also how about public participation? A key aspect also, I think, of climate justice is labor. Where do you see labor in all of this? I'm going to shut up now and look forward to your comments and other questions and comments from the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you for some great comments. I was going to throw some questions in, but I think I'll wait because Daniela had quite a few. So maybe Katja, would you like to respond, or would you like to collect more questions?
It's as you wish. I don't know whether there are other questions, but Daniela, thank you very much for helping me further develop that paper. And indeed, so you're right. It's meant to be a chapter that then, of course, also needs to fit into a bigger book project. And I have to say, many of the questions that you raised are the questions that I'm still thinking about. So thank you very much for helping me also to identify what other people would find most interesting and most relevant. And the point that I actually tried to make, and I'm not listening to you made me realize that I'm not making it strongly enough, is exactly this. In energy justice, as you rightly say, procedure and recognition and these other elements are already much more used and highlighted, and in the carbon pricing debate, not so much. So that certainly is kind of where I want to go. But the other aspect that I really am very grateful for that you raised is this question of, so what, are carbon pricing policies really so important? Do they really matter, or is it other policies? And I think that depends very much on where you look, but also this differentiation between taxes and ETSs. So I think indeed the taxes often they're very low and they're not impacting so much on certain low-income households, but yeah. In France, for example, that's still triggered quite some process. But then you also have this cap and trade example from California, for example, where it's not just the price that triggers the injustices. So I think, maybe I should also just much clearer kind of conceptualize what exactly, what do the injustices consist of, what kind of literature is there already, and what can we learn from others. So thank you very much for helping me structure many of my thoughts.
Great, well, thank you. I think also the point that Daniela makes about how the debate was centered on efficiency and that you're helping shift it to issues of justice, to me, moves it from this kind of empirical question that was the realm of economists only or mostly to this normative question, which is also the realm of ethicists and others. And the question of, distribution and its benefit for whom, I guess, is part of the typology of revenue recycling, as your excellent table showed us. For example, should it be distribution of the revenues in accordance with people's financial need? Should it be, as one of the questions asked, the first question from Ann Jordan, implying that perhaps it is a question of distribution by consumption? That is, rather than giving back some of the funds to the objectively neediest people, those with the lowest income or fewest resources, maybe part of it should be given, or all of it should be given back to those who consume the least and therefore sort of earned a rebate, if you will. So that seems like another way to think about this. And yet another one was suggested by another of the people in the audience, Alan Loeb, in an email that I know Katja also received, where he talks about sort of, in part, he talks about a range of issues, but one of them is sort of legacy emitters. In other words, should the distribution and fairness consider emissions in the past? I guess that would be by nations, but it could also just be by, by groups of people rather than by nation states. These are a range of interesting questions. I guess I'll leave it at that. I'll bracket it, and I guess if Daniela wants to answer these too, she has written on these issues also quite extensively. But let me go on to the questions in the Q&A area, which I think we got to the first one. The second one is wondering if you could expand a little bit more about what actually drives carbon prices in different countries, which is a great question because we know that they're dramatically too low, at least for the market, right? In most countries. So I guess the question is, how are they set? I think that's the rephrase of the question. And then another question comes, which is that none of the proposals you listed places the tax on the producer. They follow the Pigovian idea of taxing the consumer. What about, the idea that none of these are politically acceptable because they are entirely on the consumer and not on the producer? And furthermore, none of the listed proposals addressed the existing concentration of greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. Yeah, so they focus only, I guess, on what we would call new emissions. And the questioner says that this is an obsolete approach and cannot solve the problem, according to that view. So I guess questions to both of you. What are your thoughts?
I can begin answering these are really great questions, thanks to the public. I can begin answering the person, I think it was Marija Werner, who asked about what drives carbon pricing. Well, it's a mystery, but there are some people who have tackled this issue. I think in the last decades, going back to the topic of this broader seminar, it was more about discussing institutions. For example, I study carbon prices in North America, and some people would say, well, it's federalism and the will of subnational entities to tackle an issue that is not being discussed on the federal level or is being very politicized on the federal level. So subnational jurisdictions want to take action, and they have the leeway because there is a very strong level of federalism in North America. So that's where they go for it. In shameless self-promotion, in my work, I tackle the angle of interests. So what would be in the interest of the governments to do this? If the government prices emissions and it's going to take on some industry, let's say manufacturing industry or the oil and gas industry, what they get in return? Is it that they want to appeal to a broader public? Is it within their constituency's desire to have a more active environmental role? Or are they getting their public debt paid, like Katia mentioned before, which has been absolutely the case, in which some, in my research, I found some governors saying, yeah, I did not really care about the environment, but I had very high public debt, so I need the revenue. And that is yet another cost. So it's very context dependent. In Canada, for example, some say that subnational jurisdiction apply these carbon taxes because they were anticipating that the federal government would do it, and they didn't want to have a policy imposed by the federation. So they wanted to write the terms of how the revenues would be distributed before the federal government did it. So there's an answer almost for every part of the world that you're looking at.
You want me to continue? So I think, thanks, Daniela, you already summarized many of the findings of different studies. And indeed, it depends very much. So I don't really need to add anything to that, apart from the original idea about carbon trade that came from the United States, from sulfur dioxide and NOx emissions. And the US at the time when the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated pushed very much for that idea in the Kyoto Protocol, never ratified that protocol. And the Europeans who did not manage to implement a carbon tax, took the idea of carbon trade and ran with it. So very, yeah, I guess, as Daniela said, contextual circumstances that that then set this process in motion, and indeed often it's not necessarily a climate reason. And that's actually what we see now with the COVID recovery, I guess, even more, that it's actually quite attractive for governments as a revenue, a new revenue source rather than a climate policy. I'm not sure whether that's good or bad, but it very much links to Alan's last point, the second question. I'm just looking at it. So this, but I think it was the question about, yeah, so they only address existing concentrations, but of course we already have quite some greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So do these approaches actually really work, and is that the best approach to take? And I'm rephrasing a bit. And that is actually a question that I wonder myself, and I really also would like to stress, I'm working on carbon pricing policies, but that doesn't mean that I'm a cheerleader of carbon pricing policies. I certainly see that in a number of contexts, they can have a very good or supportive impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but often that's part of, I think in all cases, it's part of a policy mix. So the original economist's idea that this price signal can lead us to where we need to get in terms of reducing emissions has in real life certainly not played out. And so to different extents, these kinds of policies have helped us reduce emissions. But of course, getting to zero and addressing the problem that you mentioned, we already have so many emissions in the atmosphere. The carbon pricing policies are not the panacea, and they're not going to get us there, certainly not alone. And I'm just looking at other questions. I did look at the chat. Yeah, what drives me, we kind of answered that. Do you spot one that we haven't answered yet? Go for it.
About Alan's first point, where he points out that all of the places tax on the producer. And briefly speaking, Alan, there are some jurisdictions that do tackle producers. We must also have to admit that the price is either very low, or they're given exemptions, or to make it politically feasible. I think that word is key: political feasibility, like you recognize and clearly point out. To make a carbon price politically feasible, one has to take it very slow, unfortunately, slower than we need to really have an effect on mitigating climate change. But they do tax producers. Unfortunately, they, like I mentioned, give very high thresholds for cap and trades, for example, or a very low point for a very low cost in tax. The claim is that it will grow incrementally, that each year the price will be higher, that each year companies will see that this is a worldwide trend, and that they will likely seek to adapt before their competitors reduce emissions more than themselves. So that's the usual argument, right? That we have to start slow to even start at all. That a policy that exists is better than not having a policy whatsoever, because you started out too ambitious and it was rejected from the outset. And so that's how it goes, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's what some people showed, for example, for Sweden, which took that approach, right? And actually just saw that the first question, Anne Jordan rightly writes that, can you explain what incentive people would have to reduce gas consumption if a carbon tax is returned to everyone through the tax system or some other direct transfer? If I buy gas and I know that I will get the tax back at the end of the year, I have no incentive to reduce usage. You still do, because what the tax would do, it would differentiate, or it would make the contrast even starker between a car that uses a lot of gas and that's very inefficient, and, for example, an electric car. So it still, changes the comparison between the different alternatives. And I think that can still have an incentive. Well, if you get the return anyway, regardless of whether you buy fuel or an electric car, then the incentive could work that way. So you would have the money to actually afford the electric car, or you could still be more efficient and then use the money for something else. But also it's a signal to the producers. So I think it is a bit more subtle, and of course you raise an important question, which in the end would, I guess, again come down to the design. How high is the price, and what kind of product? I mean, I know just arbitrarily used cars can be different kinds of products. Or if the money is returned at the end of the year, you can maybe insulate your house and through that reduce your bill even more. So I think there are incentives, but sometimes it's not as straightforward as I might have portrayed it in the presentation. And then the question is, of course, are those incentives high enough, and do people make the link?
Great. Okay, thank you. I guess we still have a few more minutes for questions and answers if people would like to post any more questions. In the meantime, I wonder if we could take up one or two of the sort of remaining issues out there that are a little bit broader. I mean, one of them is Daniela's mention of sort of energy policy addressing some of the issues not fully addressed in the carbon pricing area. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about how perhaps energy policy is moving forward in ways that it could set an example for also carbon pricing. And then the other one is the question suggested in the typology of revenue recycling about how to generate revenue, through perhaps new expenditures, right? Which is the Green New Deal, and sort of how those might also face the justice issue and what is being done. I mean, we have an architecture out there of the European Green New Deal, and I wonder if just in a few minutes you might comment about how that portends to address some of these concerns, if it does, if that's okay. And I'm sorry, we just had one more question posted to the chat, which is from Alan Loeb about a problem with the tax rebate design is that if you give back the revenue, the government loses the opportunity. But because the government needs revenue to fulfill obligations, it has to, in effect, replace the lost revenue with general tax revenue. So there isn't really a rebate, he says. Since the taxpayer and consumer are the same person, the rebate is fictitious. So I guess maybe if you want to address that one initially, and then we could broaden out to these other questions.
Okay, I think I would need to read Alan's comment again to actually understand. Maybe I'll start with the Green Deal, and then maybe Daniela, you can do a bit of energy, and then I can try to understand and give a good answer to Alan, and then probably so just very briefly, because we're running out of time. And talking about the European experience. So as some of you might have heard, the European Commission has proposed what they call the European Green Deal. It is, in terms of its content, different from the Green New Deal that was proposed earlier in the United States. But one of the elements there actually is yet another carbon pricing variation that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's a carbon border adjustment mechanism, as they call it. And that is linked to the European cap and trade, or as we call it, emissions trading system. So basically the idea there is to charge the same carbon price as we would charge EU producers, also on importers. So steel, for example, is covered by that proposal. It's a proposal, law hasn't been adopted yet. So if I'm now an exporter into the EU, exporter to the EU of steel, then I would have to pay the same carbon price at the border that a European steelmaker would have to make, unless I'm covered by a carbon price in my own jurisdiction where I produce. So it's basically about leveling the playing field. But the discourse has changed a bit in the beginning. It was actually emphasized more that this was then a good way of generating revenues, which could then be used for actually addressing just transition in Europe. So there was a stronger discourse, I have the impression, in the beginning than there is now, of really seeing that as a revenue use. As I said, it is a bit early to talk about this because the proposal has not been adopted yet. As I said, the discourse has changed a bit as well. But certainly this is a very clear example where, governments had the dollar or the euro signs in their eyes and saw what's happening. Daniela, do you maybe want to talk about energy, and I quickly read Ellen's question again?
Yes, absolutely. So 1 decade, 2 decades before, when we talked about energy transitions, we had very few examples, right? And mostly the literature spoke about the technical elements. What is the infrastructure that a country needs? What would support an energy transition? And mostly related to electricity and somewhat transportation, but mainly electricity. So the energy transition literature was first in noticing that these had a social component and started calling them, these are social technical transitions because they have an element that goes way beyond even policy design. This is a politicized and highly contested process. How do we go about that? What role do we give the play actors like the state? Does the state always have a supportive role in a transition, or how can the role of the state play out according to different interests that the state is catering to? So I would say the transitions literature that I was referring specifically is a political economy literature that is very abundant. Peter Newell, John Stone, and they do address these issues of what is behind the decision-making process, how can we incentivize it, and yeah.
Good, then very quickly, I now understood. So Ellen, what you describe is what they call a revenue neutral carbon tax. So you levy a certain amount of money, and that's the amount of money that you give back. So it's neutral in terms of revenues for the government. Actually, British Columbia, always claims that and uses that as a selling point, telling citizens that this net doesn't cost you money, but we're kind of shifting the incentives and price relations between certain products or activities, as I earlier try to discuss. So that would work if you don't reduce any other taxes. If you adopt a carbon tax and at the same time decrease the income tax, then from the government perspective, you lose revenue. And then what you say actually, yeah, indeed makes sense. Then the government overall would lose revenue, and that can be problematic. Or of course, if you have a government that has many debts, then the question also is, what should they use the money for from an overall perspective? But I guess there you also have this trade-off. Do you look at it from a really individual perspective and justice among individuals, or is it more the maybe, as Daniela mentioned earlier, the intergenerational aspect? So reducing public debt would, of course, be very nice towards future generations, because otherwise that would accumulate. So it is then different logics, yeah. So I hope that answers that question a bit.
Thank you very much. All right, I guess it seems that maybe there aren't further questions, but there have been several good ones. Would either of the speakers, would you like to make a last comment before we thank you and segue into the final of these webinars? If there's any last comments, they're welcome. Otherwise, I guess we'll thank you very much and remind the viewers that we will have the last of these webinars next Monday, May 16th. From 3:30 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, looking at the difficult cases for climate policy of Australia and Brazil. And for now, I just want to thank both of our speakers again very much for your simplifying some very complex issues, and which really demonstrate true expertise when you can do that. So thank you very much, and we wish everybody a wonderful afternoon and evening, as it may be.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you. Thank you very much for
you.
joining us.
Bye.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.